has really been across the pathway. So I have worked in schools. I've worked in clubs as a coach, as a full-time coach, back in the UK a fair few years ago now, right the way up to working with Olympic level badminton players. So my experience that I'm going to come from in terms of the webinar is working with all different levels of player. Okay, so I'm just going to share my screen here, and we're gonna get going. Okay, so first of all, the aim of tonight's webinar is to really get you hopefully thinking maybe a little bit differently about the game of badminton, and then within that, as coaches, how you teach foundation skills to your players. And that can be through practice design, and particularly through practice design tonight. That's the one area we're going to look at. So it's just trying to get you to look at things in maybe a slightly different perspective. You will receive the PDF. So this is a PDF. There's 18 slides on it, and you will get a copy of this after. As Craig mentioned, there is time for questions. So if you do have questions, just write them down, and you can ask them at the end when we get to that point, or as Craig has mentioned, there's the Q&A function within the toolbar. Last thing to say is way of introduction, is what I'm kind of hoping what might happen after this webinar is potentially some follow-up sessions if people are interested, either to delve a bit more into some of the concepts, to bring those to life through some kind of like workshop, group work type activity, or even some practical type workshops. So that's what I'm kind of hoping. It might trigger your interest into learning a little bit more. Okay, so moving on. What I'd like you to do is just for a couple of minutes, just use the chat function in the toolbar. What comes to mind when thinking about foundation skills? So if you can just type your answers into the chat bar, and we'll get going from there. Okay, great. Thank you very much for that. And we're going to return to some of those answers that you gave a little bit later in the presentation. Okay, so what is to come tonight? What we're going to do, we're going to look at the badminton singles game. We're then going to look at the badminton singles player. We're going to look at games-based practice design. I'm going to talk a little bit about a new book that myself and Mike Woodward have got almost written and developed, a technique approach to coaching badminton singles. Then we're going to have a question and answer, and then we're going to have chance for hopefully for you guys to give some participant feedback on the webinar. So before we delve into the skills, the foundation skills required in badminton, I am looking at this from a singles point of view. So and that will hopefully become clearer later on when we look at some of the skills required, because when you play doubles, you've actually got to have awareness of your partner. So that bit will come in. So this is looking at it from a singles game and singles player, although a lot of the concepts and ideas you can transfer over to doubles. So we're going to spend probably got one slide on the badminton singles game, and then the majority of the content that I'll present to you will be talking about the badminton singles player, and within that is the skills required within badminton, the foundation skills, and then a little bit around games-based practice design, and so on. So we won't spend a lot of time on the badminton singles game, but a lot of time talking about the badminton singles player. The badminton singles game, what we're looking at here is its structure, and what is required within the game for the player to be successful. So the game presents certain things that a player has to overcome, and there's requirements within the game. So that's why we're just spending a little bit of time looking at that before looking at the badminton singles player and the skills required. Okay, so the badminton singles game, aims of the game: land the shuttlecock in the opponent's court, or prevent the shuttlecock landing in the player's court. That goes into then the laws of the game. So you've got the equipment, court boundaries, serving, scoring, and opponent. Next little bit of the structure is the game requirements: rapid problem setting and solving. In badminton, it requires rapid problem setting and solving from 0 second to 0.3, so it's very quick. And then you're in a particular game situation. So this is what the players are presented with when they experience the singles, the badminton singles game. This is important because we need to understand this before looking at the player and what the skills that the player needs. So if I was to ask the majority of people that I know within the badminton world to describe the badminton singles game, most people would come up with the laws of the game. They'd come up with things like rackets and shuttlecock and a net within the court boundaries. I'd argue that the net is part of the court boundaries. They might talk about serving and scoring, and there's an opponent. What I don't think a lot of people would necessarily think about is the game requirements, something which is a little bit more hidden. So the laws of the game is very obvious. It's very visible when you watch badminton. But the game requirements, rapid problem setting and solving, is not so visible. It's actually almost hidden within the game. So I don't expect a lot of people necessarily to come up with that. I don't expect a lot of people necessarily to think about the game situation. So when I'm in possession is when I'm striking the shuttle, and when I'm out of possession of the shuttle is all other times within a game. And if you think about other sports, particularly team-based sports like football and hockey, a team is in possession for maybe 5 passes, 10 passes. It could be 2 or 3 minutes. It could be longer. And then the opposing team is out of possession. In badminton, you're in possession for a very fleeting moment, and then you're out of possession for a very fleeting moment. So that's all happening very, very quickly. But arguably, you are in possession of the shuttle and out of possession of the shuttle. The other really interesting thing about looking at the singles game is the aims of the game. How many times do we go on beginner courses to teach beginners, or we look on the online on the internet? There's no mention of the aims of the game. There's no mention that actually what are you trying to achieve when you play badminton, and what are you trying to achieve when you play singles? it goes very, very quickly into a lot of content around grips and footwork and all that stuff. So for me, it's really important to consider the badminton singles game and what does the game present the players? What do the players have to do within the game to be successful? Okay, and then we have the badminton singles player model. So what we have here is this idea of in possession are hitting zones and out of possession hitting zones. So this is the situation that the player faces when they're in a game. So the hitting zones would be the forecourt, the mid-court, the rear court. It would be in attack, it would be in defence, or it could be in neutral play, where neither player is in attack or in defence. And then that feeds down into the solutions. What are the solutions that the player needs to have in order to be effective in exploiting their opponent's space and restricting their opponent's time when they're in possession, striking the shuttle? And likewise, when they're out of possession, what are the solutions they need? They need to cover space. The player needs to cover space, and the player needs to gain time for themselves. And then going down another level, it's the player's skills. So it's the player's skills, and we've called this the whole player's skill. So it's perception, cognition, and execution. And then in order to use the whole skill, we need to deploy a certain tools within our toolkit as a player. So when we're actually striking the shuttle in possession, we want to be early to the shuttle, we want to use deception, we want to use power, and we want to use trajectory, or another word we might prefer is accuracy. So depending on what hitting zone you're in, depending on whether in the forecourt, midcourt, or rear court, we'll decide how much focus is on deception, how much focus is on power, how much focus is on accuracy. So there's a few dependent things there. Likewise, if we're out of possession, the tool that we really want is to get to the shuttle early. So when our opponent is striking the shuttle and we're on the receiving end of that, we're out of possession of the shuttle, we want to be to the shuttle early. Now, as I mentioned before, this is all happening incredibly quickly, and it's happening in a cyclical nature. So it's happening incredibly fast and over again within the rally. So if there's 5 shots, 10 shots, 20 shots, you're switching between being in possession and out of possession and having to think about what the solutions that I have as a player, applying your whole skill, and then what tools you might need to put those skills to use. Okay, and the last point to mention about the model, the badminton singles player, is one of the tools that is not on here is the word consistency. I feel consistency is a massively overused word in badminton, and to explain that, the example I would give is maybe net shots. So when you're playing a net shot, you can be consistent playing the net shot, but if the net shot goes 10 feet over the net, it wouldn't be accurate, and it would be the wrong trajectory. The trajectory we need is to be the shuttle to land close to the net. So the better word to use would be a word like trajectory or accuracy, and not a word like consistency. If you're hitting the shuttle out the back of the court, or you're hitting the shuttle into the net, then of course you're not accurate. So yeah, I feel like we need to be a little bit careful and just not overusing the word consistency. Okay, so the remainder of this presentation here, we're not going to delve too much into this bit here around the player situation and the hitting zones. There's a lot of within the book itself. There's a lot of content around that which explains to you a lot more around the different hitting zones and how much of a certain type of tool that you might use. So, but to just give you a very quick example, if you're in the forecourt area and the shuttle is very high, then you're going to apply a lot of power. because you're going to smash the shuttle on the floor. You wouldn't be thinking so much about deception in that situation, and you wouldn't be thinking so much about accuracy. So that's a good example, but there's so much content there that I think will really help coaches out there understand the game, and also help the players understand the game, that the rest of the presentation is not going to cover the player situation. What we are going to do is look at space and time, and I noticed Simon Thompson had mentioned in the chat function, when I asked the question around what are the foundation skills, he actually, I think, was the only one who actually said space and time. So that was very interesting. Then we're going to look at the player skills, and then we're going to look at the player tools. Okay, so the rest of the looking at the badminton player is looking at those different concepts. So player solutions. When you're in possession of the shuttle, you're looking to exploit your opponent's space. So the red ring is the opponent. So I'm looking on the left-hand side of the slide over here. So I'm the player, and I'm trying to exploit my opponent's space. And the key dimensions we talk about in badminton is height, width, and depth. And by doing that, there's a very close correlation between space and time. So I'm trying to restrict my opponent's time. So as this player here, I'm trying to exploit my opponent's space, and I'm trying to restrict my opponent's time. That is the solution when I'm in possession, and I'm trying to manage the aspect of the game around rapid problem setting and solving. So any time that you're in possession striking the shuttle, or out of possession receiving the shuttle, all other times, you're constantly having to problem solve and problem set within the game of badminton. On the right-hand side, when I'm out of possession, as the player, I'm trying to cover the player space, and I'm trying to gain player time. I'm trying to gain time for myself. So this is happening constantly within a rally, and it's happening, as I mentioned earlier, incredibly quickly. Okay, and then we come to the player skills. So we have perception. Perceptual skills involves using vision to collect information about the game situation. So perceptual skills is mainly about vision. It can also be about auditory, so it's about what you hear, and it can be also about what you feel, kinesthetic. But the main perceptual skill in badminton is vision. Cognition. Cognition is cognitive skills, involves using the perceived information as the basis for selecting an action. And execution skills involves physically performing the selected action. And what we've done within the book and within our concept is think about these skills as the whole skills player. So perception can also be called tactical awareness. Cognition could also be referred to as tactical decision making, and execution is the technique. And the real key thing here is around the whole skill. And if we refer back to the question raised at the start of the webinar, most of the answers that were given relate to technique, they relate to execution. And that isn't a surprise. That's what tends to happen when thinking about the foundation skills. So what we're trying to do is just trying to get you to look at the foundation skills, not just about technique execution. It's also about perception and cognition. These are equally as important as execution. And the key thing also is that these concepts are very interlinked, and hopefully this little model over here is trying to show the connection between the three different concepts. Okay, the importance of developing whole skills. I'm just going to let you read for a couple of minutes this quote by Arsene Wenger in 2018. So yes, it's about football, but how can we apply this to badminton? So just going to give you a couple of minutes to read the quote. Okay, so I'm just gonna spend a couple of minutes just dwelling on this, reflecting on this quote, and how we apply that to badminton and badminton practice design. So when you actually play a game of badminton, if we go back to the whole skill model, what actually needs to happen first is perception. So you're picking up information within the environment, you're making sense of information. You're doing that first before any cognition is happening. So any decision making or thought processes, you actually need to perceive first, then make a decision before the execution. The cognition stage is very debatable within the motor skill and skill acquisition literature around whether or not these are conscious or unconscious processes. And I probably won't go into any more detail than that, but if you think about how quick in badminton you need to make a decision, you would imagine that a lot of those decision making is happening unconsciously. It's happening within a certain part of the brain which deals with things incredibly quickly. Pulling it back to the application of this, if we think about the practice design element and how we set up practice to compare to what is needed in the game. If I go back to what is needed in a game of badminton, the same as a game of football, you need perception first, then you need cognition, and then you need execution. You can't just rely on the execution piece. And that's what Arsene Wenger is making the point here, that same in football, there's a lot of passing type drills where they're just focusing on the execution and not on the other two elements of the whole of what we call the whole skills. And then if we go to this quote by Andre Agassi, tennis, well, it could be badminton, it's a racket sport, is about problem solving. And you can't problem solve unless you have the ability and the empathy to perceive all that is around you. So this is Andre Agassi in his autobiography making this point, and it is just as irrelevant to badminton as it is tennis. So if we look at perception, tactical awareness a little bit more, highly developed perceptual skills can quickly make sense of visual information. So when Roger Federer was playing tennis, there's some very good stats done on his return of serve. So his return of serve, he was a world-class player and he was arguably the best player of his generation. But one stat that really stood out for him was his return of serve, hitting winners and consistency, or I should use the other word, accuracy of his return of serve. He was able to get the ball back more often than not in the place he wanted it. And when they did all the studies around Roger Federer, they found that his perceptual skills, his ability to pick up visual information of his opponent's serve, was better than all the other top tennis players. So what he was doing was he was actually picking up visual information, kinesthetic information around, kinetic information around his opponent's serve. So his the opponent's arm position, the hip position. He was able to pick up that information to therefore make a decision about where he was going to start to move, where he was going to place his racket, and then the execution, the final piece of the jigsaw. So that's an example of tennis. I don't know of any specific studies done in that in badminton, but it just shows the importance of perceptual skills. Early is a significant perceptual factor. So if you are early to the shuttle, either in possession or out of possession, it really informs the subsequent actions. So your ability to be efficient with your execution and your decision making is quite likely dependent on your perception and your ability to be early. And if we break that down, perception, into three concepts, and this is what I mentioned, that this the content tonight is talking about singles, because if it was about doubles, we'd have partner awareness. So this is self-awareness, opponent awareness, and space awareness. So these are some of the things that we need to consider when we're looking at a player and how tactically aware they are. Really important about these type of concepts that you're essentially, when you're in the rally, you're having to think about. And as I mentioned, a lot of the time this stuff is happening unconsciously. Okay, then we have cognition, tactical decision making. So the selected action that the player decides to use aims to achieve one or both the following player solutions. So the selected action is trying to exploit the opponent's space and restrict the opponent's time when in possession of the shuttle, and when out of possession of the shuttle, the player is trying to cover their own player space and gain player time for themselves. So they're the solutions that's happening within the cognition stage of the whole skill. And in order to do that, we're looking to deploy one or more of the following, what we call the player tools. So this is the ideas of early, deception, power, and trajectory. So in order to apply the whole skill, the player's having to deploy one or more of these tools. And as I mentioned earlier, some of the strokes will have more or less deception depending on the hitting zone. So it's almost like a palette of paint. You're taking different amounts of color and mixing them together. Sometimes it might only be one color. Sometimes it might be lots of colors, depending on the situation. And then I think the area that the concept of the skill that we're most familiar with is execution technique. And what we've managed to do within the book is basically narrow this down to 2 slides within this presentation. So this is the movement one, and then we have the hitting skills. So the idea of this is not to present the coaching points for every stroke or movement on this slide within the game of badminton. This is to say these are the technical concepts that if you applied very early on within a beginner player curriculum, that if they're able to do these things, these performance indicators, they're off to a very good start. And they're very much linked to the different player tools. So if I take the first one as an example, if we're going to be early to the shuttle, then the technical concept we need there is an explosive start. And what that looks like is a rebound from the floor, timed with an opponent's hit, set off in the direction of the opponent's hit, and the short ground contact time. And I'm sure most of you have probably read on through the rest of those different examples. So that is movement. And as I mentioned, this is about concepts and not to give you content. And then on the hitting, we've got technical concepts of racket carriage, relaxed reach, grips, hitting shapes, and hitting coordination. If you do each of those one things, then you're going to get, then that helps you achieve the different player tools. So if I want to be early and achieve power, then the technical concept that underpins that is a relaxed reach. If I want to be early, I want to have power, I want to get trajectory, and I want to be achieve deception, then I have to have the right grips. And if you look at the performance indicators around that, is to give ideas around how that might be achieved. The performance indicators are not there necessarily as coaching points. It's more for you as a coach to understand the different technical or biomechanical information, if you like. So it's not a question necessarily of just repeating that information to players, and that's one of the things that the book goes into in a much more detail. Okay, then we come on to games-based practice design. And the important thing about games-based practice design is it's the merging of the different structures and requirements within the badminton singles game. So if you have within your games, within your practice design, something that replicates trying to achieve the aim of the game, it has as many, or if not all, of the laws of the game within it. It has elements of rapid problem setting and solving in the context of a game situation, in possession or out of possession, and you are developing perception, cognition, and execution, not just one of those elements. And you're putting that all together. That is our definition or our move towards a more games-based practice design. And I'm hoping that in a follow-up type session or even a practical session, maybe that we can actually look at some of how to actually put some of these ideas into actually setting up a practice. But what we do have is probably some examples of non-games-based practice design. So there's 3 examples there: shadowing on the court, movements in a set order. We've got wall hitting, and we've got predictable rally, hand feed, net shot, and stop. So the practice just stops after a net shot. And if you just move along the different ones, you can see that, you know, in the aims of the game, in the first example, shadowing on the court, there's no element of trying to land the shuttlecock on the opponent's side or prevent the shuttlecock landing on their side. So there's no relationship to that at all. Laws of the game: there's no shuttle, no opponent, no serving, no scoring. There's no problem setting or solving within that. And when we look at the whole skill, there's a massive focus on execution and not on perception and cognition. And it's the same for wall hitting and predictable hand feed. So these are just some examples of when it would be non-games based practice design. And what this is not aimed to do is to say that don't do these practices or these practices are wrong. All I'm saying is that we would regard these as non-games based practice design because they don't contain the structures or the elements within the game model, which is having the aims of the game, having the laws, the game requirements, and actually developing the whole skill. So it's not to say you can't do these practices. It's just if you're trying to apply a games-based approach to your practice with your players, then these would be some examples that wouldn't do that. Okay, good. We're going to move on to probably the last little bit, Craig, and we've actually flew through that quite quickly, which is good because it means that we can get onto some questions. As I mentioned at the start, myself and Mike Woodward are fairly far through writing a book which is called A Technique Approach to Coaching Badminton Singles. And the idea of that is, if you haven't already guessed from perception, cognition, and execution, when we talk about technical and tactical, it's a play on words with technique, where we're trying to design practice and that develops the whole skills and not just execution. So Mike, for those who don't know him, he was the BWF materials writer. So he wrote the shuttle time course that a lot of you will be familiar with. He wrote the BWF level 1, level 2, and he wrote most of the level 3 awards. So we've been venturing on this project for probably over a year and a half now, writing this book. A lot of the content, some of the content, I should say, is being covered. So we're looking to release this no later than this coming summer. It will cover some of the theoretical foundations of technique coaching. So looking at the badminton singles game, the badminton singles player, explaining a little bit more about what technique coaching is, and then how to practically apply that. So within the book, there'll be 100+ practices that are what we regard as technique practices. So technique practices that involve an element of or certainly all of the elements or structures of the game model, and really thinking about developing the whole skill. So there'll be 100+ practices in that, as well as associated how to coach skills. So within a games-based type approach to coaching, there's certain how to coach skills that lend themselves more to a games-based approach than others. So for example, if you're using skills like observation, noticing, and questioning skills, they're very kind of aligned to a games-based approach. It's not to say you can't use feedback and instructions. It's just that things like noticing skills and questioning skills, and actually getting the group to learn off each other, is very much aligned to a games-based approach. So that's all that's in the book, that'll be coming out in early summer. Okay, Craig. As always, very difficult to know the timings of this, but certainly I'm happy that we finished the main content a little bit earlier than probably thought. But it does certainly give us a good 25 minutes around questions, and then after that, I've just got a little bit around just trying to gather some feedback from tonight. So essentially, we're here in the night Q&A, and then we've got participant feedback. So I'll just stop sharing at this point and go from there.
Right, so we have a few in here, Tom. I'll go through them, and
Yep.
I have one or two myself then as well, just from a club perspective, and then just actually from my own perspective as well. So first one here's from Mike. So Mike says, seems far removed from the coaching skills that we learn in level one coaching. Should the level one coaching manual be updated to reflect this? And would you select these skills to teach to beginner children? So kind of two questions there, I suppose.
Yeah, no worries. So within the book itself, we've got, which I didn't put on the slide there because I didn't want to put everything, but within the book there is a chapter at the end called frequently asked questions. And we've already started to prepare what we feel might be some of the frequently asked questions. And interestingly, you've just asked one of them, which is around beginners. So I'll kind of cover that off first, Mike, if that's okay. Okay, so we believe that technique coaching has a place within beginners and beginner coaching. It won't be as maybe prevalent as intermediate and advanced players, but it's certainly got a place within beginner coaching. The caveat to that is that yes, there needs to be a fair amount of time focusing around the technique, the execution part of the stroke. But I could probably, the next thing I'm about to say, probably I can't say probably strong enough. So hopefully I get this across really quite well. What I think happens within coaching is coaches spend way too long within the execution technique world and not moving from that type of practice where it's almost decontextualized and doesn't really look or feel like the game of badminton, because there's no opponent, there's no decision making. It's very repetitive, just focusing on the execution part. And as we've seen from some of the quotes and hopefully some of the models I've shown you, we need perception, we need cognition, we need execution. So yes, with beginners, I say complete beginners, and I don't feel beginners are beginners for very long, by the way. I feel beginners are actually only a beginner for a very short amount of time. I believe that the execution bit needs to be a lot shorter, a lot less time before coaches move them on into more technique type practice. So hopefully I've kind of answered that. So it's not necessarily wrong. Just the second part to that, there's also a number of other factors, Mike, which affect that. You have to think about the environment you're in, who you're coaching, where you're coaching. You know, if you're coaching 35 primary school children in a one-court hall, then that certainly limits some of the stuff that you can do. If you're coaching in a 6-court hall, 4-court hall with 5-6 players, and that's obviously a lot easier to bring in some of the concepts we've talked about. So there's a few factors that are dependent, but I certainly believe that players spend way too long within this technical world of coaching when they are just repeating the skills. They have almost mastered the skill within the practice that they're doing, and they need to be moved on a lot quicker. And the reason they need to be moved on a lot quicker is because they need to be experiencing more of the replication of the game and what that looks like for those skills to be transferred. Okay, so a bit slightly long-winded, but we have got lots of time. So second part of the question is a very simple yes, Mike. The BWF qualifications do need to be updated. Um, as I mentioned, Mike Woodward is co-writing this book with me, and he'll say that himself, that it's outdated. It needs a refresh and new content, and I hope that some of the concepts that we've talked about tonight and what will be in the book will be brought into the new course materials and the qualifications, because I think it's important that coaches are thinking outside and a lot more to coaching the players than just the execution technique bit. Hopefully that's answered your question, Mike.
Thanks for that one, Mike. We'll go on to the next one. So next one from Carol Tom. She's asking, how would you use this to coach children who have ADHD or autism as part of the club, or possibly children with physical disabilities? So a
Yeah,
slightly different question here, to the last one.
yeah. So yeah, I mean, like, if you're looking purely at the game model with the aims of the game, the laws of the game, the rapid problem solving and setting, and then the in possession, out of possession, so what the actual game is, um, you'd have to strip probably some of that stuff back. So you can still have elements of trying to land the shuttle, or it'd probably be an object. So rather than a shuttle, it might be a balloon, because the balloon is slower. It's easier for the hand-eye coordination. It's easier for players with disabilities to track the shuttle. But you can still have an element of a game type approach, with complete beginners or learning or physical disabilities. But you might not use a shuttle. You might adapt the equipment. You might adapt the size of the court, the net. But you're still trying to keep some of these things present within the practice environment. You're not trying to remove the court boundaries. You're trying not to remove the net. You're trying to use rackets. You might have shorter rackets rather than longer rackets, because it's easier to connect with the shuttle. You would still have rapid problem solving a setting if there's a games based type practice with an opponent and a net and court boundaries. You're still trying to win the point with scoring. There's always things you're trying to do at the level that's suitable for the players in front of you. Hopefully that's, Carol, that's answered your question around that.
Thanks, Carol. Next one here is from Alan Tom. He's asking, if a player can't execute shots properly, should they still do game awareness? So interesting one.
Yeah, no, that is an interesting one. There is a school of thought, Alan, that you can't actually separate the perception, cognition, and execution at all. They're so closely merged with each other that you need both. So all I would say to you is, if you're focusing on, say, some of the technical points around a particular stroke or movement, think about what is the information that the player is perceiving in the lead up to striking or moving, or striking the shuttle or moving. So one of the things I would just throw out there, and I think it's probably a good example, is if we hand feed the shuttle, the information that the player is perceiving is completely alien and different to what actually happens in a game. So the timing of the player's internal thinking, if you like, and then what the messages that the brain sends to the muscles in terms of then the mechanics for technical things that they're going to do, the timing of all of that is actually being messed up, because they're perceiving something which they don't actually perceive. So whenever I've tended to do shuttle time type courses with teachers that maybe not from a badminton background, and I would actually always say to them, it's worthwhile the investment of time to get the players to hit the shuttle out of hand to racket, so out of the hand with a racket rather than hand feed. Now they might mess that up for the first session, and not feed the shuttle where the player maybe needs it. But you could argue that in a game situation, the shuttle never comes back to the same place anyway. So there is a little bit of room for racket feeding, which is not accurate. But of course, if they're not able to hit anywhere near the target, then that's not good. But it is worth the investment to, if we're practicing net shots, for example, or net lifts, it's worth the time rather than hand feeding to actually get the players to forehand or backhand racket feed, because at least there's some sort of relationship or to the perception of what's happening in the game. And as I mentioned, it might take a little bit of practice, but that practice is going to be very useful because that transfers over to serving. Because if you're hitting out the hand to racket feed, you're also going to be much better when you actually come to serve in badminton. So that makes sense to me to do that anyway. So spend as little time or as you need to on the execution bit. Don't aim for perfection. There is no such thing as perfect technique. There's look more at the tools that the player applies. What is the outcome of those tools that they've applied? So being early, power, trajectory, deception. If a player is able to apply those tools, but it doesn't quite fit the BWF level 1 manual, who cares? All right. So if I give an example from another sport, say for example golf, I always use golf, but there's other examples. There was a player a fair few years ago, Jim Furyk, who was American player who had the best driving accuracy on the PGA Tour for quite a few number of years. You would never teach Jim Furyk. You would never teach your players necessarily to coach to swing the club like Jim Furyk, but it worked for him because he was accurate. He hit with power and he hit with accuracy. So I think what tends to happen a little bit in coaching is that, and I was guilty of this 20 years ago, is that I was so ingrained into this. There's this perfect technical model that it really just like it just linchpinned me really. Like I was so stuck in that world. And when I actually realized that it's more about the outcome of the stroke, who really cares what it kind of looks like? Does it work for them in the game? If it does, then do we need to change it? I think there is some good badminton examples out there as well. But I think Jim Furyk in golf, if you YouTube that, the golf swing is so peculiar. It's worth looking at. So yeah, the message is don't spend as much time in the execution world. Try and think about the whole skills a little bit more.
Thanks, Tom. Good question and nice answer. And we'll go on to the next one. From Carol again here. She's just asking, what kind of drill would you do to get kids to make decisions rather than just develop their skills?
Yeah, so I'll pick out an example which I think is a really good one. Okay, so if we're working on I'll get net shots, forehand net shots. Rather than getting somebody to hand feed, or I'd prefer if they racket feed. So rather than getting the feeder, and we'll put a feeder to hit the shuttle, throw the shuttle over the net, and to hit the net shot, and to repeatedly do that time and time again. Rather than do that, make the feeder an active opponent. So yes, they might feed the shuttle over the net or hit the shuttle over the net with their racket, but the person hitting the net shot has got a choice between a net shot and a lift. Okay, so they've got a choice of a net shot and a lift, and they'll score a point if the opponent who's just fed it is unable to catch the shuttle. So the person who's fed it is trying to react to, is it going to be a net shot or is it going to be a lift? Now, the focus of your session might be on improving the execution around the net shot. And it might be that this particular player won't hit the shuttle very far to the back because they've not, they're a beginner and they've not got much experience. But that is better than just somebody stood there who's not really part of the game. They're not like an opponent. They're just stood there feeding it and they're hitting 50, 60, 70 net shots. It's better that the player is making some decision making around it. It might not even be a lift. It could be like a cross net shot. It could be a net shot, but just trying to beat them with that net shot. If the lift is really that bad because they've not got any sort of like coordination with the shuttle, then trying to beat them with the net shot rather than just get it over the net would be better than just 50 net shots. But if they're able to play a lift or a net shot, that is certainly better. And that player trying to catch it, brings in an element of competition and scoring into it. Hopefully that helps with that particular. But you could use that example that I just gave there with any stroke, really. Yeah, hopefully that's okay. Great.
Thanks for the question again, Carl. We'll move on to the next one here from Andy. He's asking, what would the sell be to players when coaching? Or sorry, what would the sell to players when coaching with this emphasis? Can you describe what you think would be the attraction to players?
Yeah, very good question. Yeah, I think I would answer this in the sense that the sell would be are the best players. So if we're looking at like, I'm going to try and put this in the context of performance of like a good club level player or a county level player or a talent or a tournament type player. That if you want to get better, if you want to win more tournaments, if you want to reach a higher level, the sell is that you'll become a much more tactically aware player. You will by doing more games-based practices, you will very much improve your anticipation, which kind of falls a little bit into perceptual skills and decision making. Your errors, your amount of mistakes you make in a game. Is that down to the execution bit, or is that down to the lack of perceptual and cognitive skills? So quite often, when we look at a player and they hit it in the net 5 times, oh, it's the grip, it's the grip. Well, is it the grip, or is it that they were late perceiving the shuttle? They were indecisive about where the opponent might be. Their brain wasn't working quick enough to make a decision. So you're getting much more bang for your buck by developing the whole skill within your practice, because that is what the game requires. The game of badminton, like any games-based sport, requires the whole skills. It doesn't just need the execution bit. So you're going to improve your all-round performances are going to get better. You have to have the perception to start with. That is absolutely key. So your anticipation skills, your tactical awareness, you're going to be much more intelligent on court. You're going to be earlier to the shuttle because you're reading the play. There's all these things that you're going to be much better at. And I'd probably argue, although some people on the call might know a bit better than me, that a lot of the top singles players now, I would call them very offensive, anticipatory type players, where they're trying to create time for themselves, and they're trying to make sure that they're boss in charge of the rally. And I think the types of players which I would call like running type players, where they just get the shuttle back, they just return the shuttle. I'm not too sure how many world-class badminton players in singles there are like that anymore. I think the top majority of world-class players now are the ones that are able to get a little edge, be a bit quicker in the rally, and get the advantage through this idea of managing time and space, which is incredibly important. So yeah, I think there's lots of advantages, hopefully from a performance player point of view, and then from a grassroots player point of view, as I said before, yes, we might need to be focusing on execution skills, but just don't do that for as long as maybe you need to, because if you want your skills to transfer to a game, because that's what every player wants to do, they want to get better in a game. Your practice has got to replicate more of what the game looks like and what the skills that you need are. And as we've talked about, the skills are just not about footwork and grip and fundamental movement skills. I'm just reading out some of the things that you gave as answers. So it's not just about that, and hopefully that message is coming across. Okay, Andy, I hope that's okay.
Thanks, Sam. A lot of detail in that one. Thanks for the answer. Um, okay, so another one from Julianne here. Something a bit different. So a teen with slow cognition. How do you help them work on their decision making? Very good technique, just slow to react. Can this be something that can be worked on?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the way that it's been described, Craig, if correct me if I'm wrong, it seems like the question is more maybe when you're out of possession. So out of possession is defined by basically not striking the shuttle. So if you're striking the shuttle, you're in possession, and any other time you're not striking the shuttle, you're actually out of possession within the rally. So I think that's the context that the question is being asked. Um, so to give some examples around that, if you're going to improve your cognition, your decision making, you wouldn't have shuttlecock machines. If anybody's seen those, where there's a machine which fires out shuttlecocks, you just wouldn't do that because that's not going to improve the perceptual cognitive skills required in badminton. It's got no relation to that. You would try to just set up really realistic game-like type practices where the player or players are picking up information which is very similar to a game situation. So I mentioned the rope, the kind of like the machine type thing. In my view, machines, and it isn't just badminton, it's cricket, where they use a cricket bowling machine. It's not offering the player any information which they can actually use when it comes to an actual game. So these are just really, in my mind, really bad practices. We want the practice to replicate the game, the performance environment, i.e., a game of badminton as close as possible. So, just think about realistic situations, avoiding hand feeding as much as you can. We'll do that. And then it comes down to your coaching skills. So that's something that we go into the book quite a lot of depth on. So one of the chapters is around questioning skills. So I believe that a lot of the questions we ask players in our coaching is more to do with, well, what grip are they using, or how did they achieve more power in that stroke? It's very much related to execution. And what we actually need to start doing is asking questions that make players think and more aware about the situation within the rally and what information are they focusing on. Because quite often a player might be beaten by the same stroke in the rally, and quite often we might think that's the footwork's not quick enough, but it's not footwork. It's not their ability to move their feet quickly. It's their ability to pick up the information from their opponent. So unless we practice that, unless we practice a lot of different types of practices, which can practice the same situation as you get in the game, you won't get better at it. You won't improve your perception and cognitive skills, your decision making, unless you're actually doing it. So yeah, hopefully that helps with that answer.
Thanks for that one, Julianne. Okay, a couple more here. One from Yana. She's asking, what would the first step or skill you would teach a total beginner? Or what would that be?
Yeah. So this question comes up a lot. I'm not sure there's one specific stroke or movement, but I do believe very strongly that the first strokes that we should be teaching players is underarm. So we work underarm, then we work slightly upwards, like mid-court drives situation, and then we go to overhead. And there's two main reasons for that. The first reason is that it's actually a lot easier to perceive and pick up information and select an action. So make a decision, select an action with underarm strokes, because it's to do with the way that the eyes are tracking the shuttlecock or the object. So it's easier for a player to get success underarm than it is overhead. If you think about having to look up whilst you're moving, whilst you're you're probably standing there, but maybe you're moving a little bit. You're looking up. It's very difficult to track an object. So starting underarm, that could be lifts, net shots. Some people think that the best stroke is a backhand serve to start with. Some people think it's a forehand low serve or forehand high serve. The second reason I would start with underarm strokes and build up is that in order to get better overhead, it requires a player to serve, to hit underarm. So why start overhead when you need, if you've got 10 players in a sports hall and you want to practice overheads, you need the player to be able to high serve accurately for the player to practice their overhead. So that's another really good example. Otherwise, the player's not practicing their overheads. And I'm very keen on, as I mentioned earlier, about not hand feeding. And if I look at the way that a lot of coaches set up practice for overheads, they actually feed the shuttle from outside the court. So because of safety reasons, because they don't want to stand in front of somebody hitting an overhead. So they stand at the side of the court and throw the shuttle up. The shuttle's not coming anywhere from the direction it comes from in a game. So it's very unrealistic, and it's not developing those skills which replicate the game. So if you start underarm, you're going to get the wins on the overheads. So that's really the answer to that. Was there a second part to that, Craig?
No, just about teaching a skill to a total beginner, and what would that be?
Yeah, so I think you want to start underarm and build up. It could be serves, it could be some other strokes, net shots, lifts. Yeah, I think it's I don't think it's a good thing to start overhead or even mid court type drives where you're hitting at the side of the body. I think underarm is the place to start.
Yeah, sound advice. Thanks, Tom. Another one here from Mike around your book. Is it going to have any exercises that can encourage development of perception?
Yeah, Mike. So the technique that the 100+ technique practices will all have. They'll all be developing the whole skill, so perception, cognition, execution. There's no practices in there like what I call keepy uppies. So within the shuttle time program, there's an exercise which I'm not saying is wrong. I'm just saying it isn't a technique practice because it just is so far removed from the game model and the whole skill, So keepy uppies, wall work, just hand feeding, hit the shuttle and stop. These type of practices are not within the 100+ practices. All the practices within the book are games-based type practices where it's about trying to beat the opponent, developing the whole skill, decision making within it. And we believe that yes, it is appealing to intermediate upwards players, but there is an element of you can bring these practices in with beginners a lot earlier than what tends to happen. So long answer there, but short answer is yes, 100+ practices for coaches to be able to use.
Thanks, Tom. The final one here again, just from Carol. Just an example for the learn as they play type exercise. Would something like beat the champ be suitable for that, or would you have any other suggestions, maybe, Tom?
I think if I interpret beat the champ, I think that is where a good player, or it could be even be the coach, is on one side of the net, and there's a queue of players the other side of the net, and they're trying to beat the
or you could typically play between 1 and 3 points, and it might be winner stays on, for example, for a maximum of maybe 3 rounds. But it's a short amount of points and a short game.
To beat the champ.
Yeah.
I think I'd be much prefer what your second bit there, Craig, around the best players on the court, and then a player steps on for 3 or 4 points, tries to beat them. If they don't, if they do if they win, great. If they don't, they don't. They move, and the next player comes on. So I quite like that. I'm just going to refer back to what I would call as like round robin. Round robin is quite a very popular thing that happens in badminton. I understand why it happens. So round robin being that it could be like beat the champ is the coach is one side of the net, 5, 10, 15 players the other side of the net. They're in a queue, so they're waiting their turn to come onto court and play their stroke. So if we're going to use that type of practice, what I'd urge coaches to do is to think about how much benefit is that doing to the development of the player versus not. And then you also, of course, have to bring into things like how much fun they're having, how much social interaction they're having, because we have to understand that coaching any sport isn't just about the technical, tactical. It's also about the other skills that players develop. So all I'm saying is beat the champ or the round robin type example. If we're doing that type of practice for personal, social type reasons, great. If we're doing that from a technical, tactical development point of view, you've got to be really careful. And the reason you've got to be really careful is because I believe that if a player is coming from the back of the court, moving forwards, what it's actually doing is encouraging the player to use a panhandle grip. And we don't want that. So because they're coming from the back onto the court, it actually encourages them to do that. So if you're going to do that, why not get them in a queue near the net area? So they're at the net area, and then they have to move backwards to hit the shuttle. They run off the back of the court and join the queue somewhere near the net. I think that's a better adaptation to that practice than getting people lined up at the back of the court. I think it does encourage the panhandle grip, which with a lot of beginners and not just youngsters, but some adults as well to do that. So yeah, I think that's important to just to think about that.
Thanks, Tom. Um, just a couple more here. They keep coming in as you're
Yeah,
going, so I'll keep them going. One from Anthony here is just asking about what would the basic footwork you might teach to children maybe under 10 years old.
yeah. So I'm just going to share my screen again here at this point. So we're just talking about the execution part of movement. Anthony, it's everything in here. And I hope this answers your question around footwork. So explosive starts, some descriptions there, controlled footwork. So that's your movements forwards, backwards, and sideways. So it's doing walking, running, chassieing, cross behind, sidestep, hop, and pivot. And you're doing all of that forwards, backwards, and sideways in a controlled way. It's your lunge movement when you're striking the shuttle. So it's a long stride, mainly racket leg, non-racket leg also, especially in mid-court, any direction. It's your jumps, 1 foot takeoff, 2 foot takeoff. There's all different combinations of hops and bounds, and there's also rotation within the air. So I would put footwork under movement, and I think one of my I hope this helps people, and obviously I'm hoping all this helps. But one of my kind of philosophies when I was coaching was I never really taught players how to move in between the explosive start that I've called it. More commonly, you guys might know as a split step. I would never talk about whether to use a cross behind a running step. I would only ever talk about improving and the explosive start, the split step, and the lunge or the land. So if a player decides to run or cross behind or chasse, in my view, we don't need to get into that detail. We don't need to be that prescriptive about how somebody moves. It's in some ways in coaching, I particularly feel in movement. And footwork. It's a really good opportunities to allow players to develop as naturally to them and what suits them, rather than saying it has to be a split step or explosive start, chasse, lunge. It has to be that in that situation. Why not teach them how to start, teach them how to end or slow down, if you like, with a lunge or a jump when they're striking the shuttle. Everything else they do in between, why not let them discover and work out what works for them? Because I'm not sure there is any right way. I think with under 10s, you need to give them the repertoire of many different movements, and I think that's where some of the fundamental movement skills stuff that's out there comes into that. And badminton is so closely aligned to some of the fundamental movement skills. You want to give players as many opportunities to explore lots of different options and lots of different solutions, rather than being really prescriptive about you must do this in this situation. They have to be able to push off quickly. They have to be able to lunge safely and effectively. They have to be able to jump, do all different types of jumps within badminton. That's what has to happen. Everything else in between is very individual, in my view, and we shouldn't be so prescriptive around that. Hopefully, that's helped that answer that.
Thanks, Tom. Good advice. One or two more. I'm conscious on time now. That's we'll try and wrap up soon as well. Just some ideas for good skills on practicing perception, Andy, from Jana.
Some good ideas of practicing perception. Yeah. So it's probably not too different, I think, from some of the answers I've given around perception before. You are wanting to set the practice up that the player is responding to a stimulus. They're responding to something. So let me take this in a slightly different direction, Craig, actually, because I feel like it's getting a bit samey. Okay, so if we're doing ladder drills, ladders are there's no perception in ladders. Ladder drills are a purely execution element, which, in my view, and this is only my view, in my opinion, I don't feel ladders develops what we think it develops. I think we use ladders for agility and speed, and actually all we're really doing is developing like hand feet coordination. If you think about the movements we do on the ladder, how does that actually transfer to the movements on the court? I'm not sure it does. What I'd much rather do, if we're developing speed and agility, is a drill whereby a player is having maybe to respond to their opponent. So quite hard to explain, but if you imagine there's a net, two players are on the badminton court and they're both one side of the net. So you've got a net, two players on the same side. One player is facing towards the net and one player is facing towards the player. Okay, so you've got a player near the net facing the back of the court, and you've got a player, say in the mid-court area, facing the net. So the two players are facing one another. The aim of the game is the player is trying to touch the net without the player touching them. So they're trying to touch the net without, and you got the player at the net trying to guard the net. So they're trying to stop the player from guarding the net. So there'll be all sorts of elements of change of direction, speed and agility within that drill, because the player's reacting to what's happening in front of them, reacting to the movements of their opponent, which is much more similar to a game of badminton than doing any sort of like speed and agility drills where there's no stimulus, there's no information to react to. So you're having to perceive, when you've got a player in front of you and you're trying to get past them to touch the net, you're having to perceive their movements of their body. You're having to then make a decision very quickly to select an action. Am I going to put my arm there? Am I going to put my feet there? The technical execution bit. That for me is a much better way of developing the perception than no kind of opponent, very much, if you like, predictable way of doing it. So like a shadow type movements, if you're doing shadow type movements and you know the corner you're going to move to before you move there, then there's no perception in that, because you're not reacting to the stimulus, you're not reacting to something. And whatever you're reacting to, you want that to be as realistic to the game. So if somebody's pointing their racket is there another way we can do shadow movements which isn't just pointing your racket? Because in a game, you never react to somebody pointing their racket, you're reacting to the shuttle being hit off a racket. So is there ways that we can get a bit closer to that if we're doing shadow? So hopefully that gives a few ideas around perception.
Thanks, Tom. Okay, we're nearly at the end of our questions here. There's another question there from Andy about does he see any of the concepts this evening coming into coach education? I'm not sure if that's a question for me or for Tom, but I'll give it to Tom.
Yeah, well, I think in other sports, where they're a little bit more updated, they've started to bring in the idea of perception, cognition, execution, trying to think about different approaches to coaching that isn't so technique focused. It is maybe a bit more games based, and I think I hope that within our coach education that potentially maybe this book, Andy, might stimulate a few thoughts within the BWF around updating what's out there. The BWF stuff is, there's some really good content in it. The BWF level 1 manual, level 2 manual, there's a hell of a lot of detail around the coaching points for every single stroke and every single movement. In my view, what's more important for a coach is to understand the underpinning technical concepts, and hopefully I presented those tonight in a really accessible way that if a player is able to understand and basically do these technical concepts within what's being shown tonight, then they can apply that to any stroke or movement. So I would rather the BWF stuff more about concepts rather than content. The content's out there. So YouTube, it's all over YouTube. Some of it's really good, and there's a lot of really rubbish stuff. I'm hoping it does change, and the coach education stuff eventually, Andy. Yeah. Craig.
I'm gonna pass it to you now, just for any wrap up that you'd like to do, and then I'll
Yeah,
do my side.
absolutely. Yeah. So, look, I just want to thank you everybody for joining. This is certainly the first time that I've presented this content. I think it was only yesterday I was updating some of it. We're constantly evolving these chapters within the book to refine it and try to make it more easy to understand and to apply. But I would like some feedback. We've got about 2 or 3 minutes here, Craig. So I'm just going to share my screen here one final time. And we really are at this point here where can anybody use the chat? Can you use the chat function? Just give initial thoughts to the session. If you're able to be specific about the content, about the way it was presented, great. And my email address is on there. I would love to get some really detailed feedback from all of you. But if we can just spend 2 or 3 minutes just with the chat function, just giving a bit of feedback initially, that would be good.
Thanks, Tom. We are probably ourselves going to send a survey out to anyone who attends most of the webinars. As you know, we are running one every month until April. So next month's edition will be based around psychology with Paula Hearn, who's got is working on a PhD in psychology at the moment, coming on to talk about psychology in sport in general, not specifically badminton, but just something really different and interesting for you guys to jump on. So the registrations are open now on Sport 80 as well. So you can hop on that for free for anyone who's affiliated through the clubs and or volunteering. So Tom, I'm gonna let you read through the chat, and thanks so much to everyone who jumped on this evening. I hope you enjoyed it. It's great for me to sit and listen for once, and soak it all in. So that was really good. Hopefully we'll see you guys on the next webinar. It's going to be February the 15th, so a Thursday evening at the same time. And we're going to have Paula Hearn from Sport Ireland on, who does psychology with all of our junior athletes at the moment. So in the Institute of Sport. So it's going to be really interesting. I'm looking forward to that one. Again, thanks a million, Tom, for leading this evening.
Yeah, no problem. Some really good points in the chat, and like I said, I can talk to Mike, but anybody gives really detailed feedback about tonight is obviously going to help us inform the book, and that's what part of the reason was. And maybe there's a free book in there for somebody. So loving the comments coming through with some of the stuff. But we're really looking for somebody, or as many of you as possible, really to think about the content from tonight and how you apply it in your own coaching and what it means to you. And I've got my emails on the screen now. I'd love to get some real detailed feedback. And like I said, this book will be published hopefully before summer. And yeah, we really want to get the messages out there. So hopefully it helps. Craig, thanks very much. Yeah, I'll share the PDF with Craig, and he'll get that out there to you guys. There's a couple
Yeah.
of questions around that.
Yeah,
So.
I'll email that on to everyone, and I'll email you a link to the next webinar. And if Tom ever makes his book available, I'll make sure I keep in touch with everyone on that. All right.
Great.
All right. Thanks a million, everyone.